Today we're going to talk about the history and recent events in Iran. And something to keep in mind is that Iran is perennially in the news. Iranians were known to have liberated the Jews from Babylonia in the 6th century BCE, and now Israel feels threatened by Iran's development of nuclear weapons. So today let's look at the recent history of Iran, and I'd like to start by talking about what led to the Islamic Revolution and Iranians' reactions towards the West. Perhaps a convenient point to start is to just first give you a little background on the location of Iran. Iran is in West Asia, so right there on the eastern fringes of the Middle East. It is roughly the size of the state of Alaska. It borders Turkey, Iraq to its west, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan to its north. The Caspian Sea is right on its north. And to the east, we have Pakistan and Afghanistan. To the south is the Persian Gulf, through which about 40% of the world's energy flows. So Iran is very important strategically in terms of its location. And its location is connected with oil, crude oil, which powers most of what we do in the West and around the world. In fact, Middle Eastern oil was discovered in Iran in the year 1908. It was discovered in Iran under a concession granted to a British company, a company that eventually became British Petroleum. Just prior to the discovery of oil in Iran, the British and the Russians had entered into what was called the Anglo-Russian Treaty of 1907. Under the terms of that treaty, Britain and Russia agreed to divide Iran into spheres of influence. The British getting southern Iran, so they could connect to British India, the Russians getting the northern part, so it would be contiguous with Russia. Of course, neither power bothered to consult Iran on this decision before they made it. Okay. The net result is that you have the discovery of crude oil in southwestern Iran, and within a year, British troops move into the region to actually secure that area and protect the oil fields. Once again, the Iranians had no say in this. As a result, with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, you have Iranian nationalists siding with Germany against the rest of Europe in the hope that they'd be able to push the British and the Russians out and reinstate their national sovereignty. However, that was not to be. The Russians and the British moved in. The Russians came right down from the north. The British moved in from what is now Iraq and also from British India, and essentially carved up Iran. They didn't colonize Iran in the sense that India was colonized. Rather, they just militarily took control of it. The war years saw an outbreak, a disastrous outbreak of famine right across the whole of Iran. And you also had the consolidation of British and Russian power. So the British and the Russians were now competing not just for control of Iran politically, but also for control of Iran's resources, in particular crude oil, but also they were looking at natural gas. What we now know is that Iran has the world's 4th largest reserve of crude oil and 2nd largest reserve of natural gas. So energy was important, and particularly because the British Navy had moved to petroleum to fuel its ships. So in this tussle between the Russians and the British, essentially the two superpowers of that time, Iran was caught. Iranians were turning to Germany during the First World War. What happens next is even more interesting, because in the tussle between the Russians and the British decide that they need to have someone in charge of Iran who is loyal to London. What they do is they find a colonel in the Iranian army, a colonel named Reza Khan. They groom him to gradually take over Iran. Eventually, he moves the Iranian army down to Tehran, takes over, and is made prime minister. That lasts only a very short time, because in 1926, he compels the Iranian parliament to declare him the new Shah or King of Iran. So we have the founding of the Pahlavi dynasty, in part through British influence, in 1926. So Reza Khan becomes Reza Shah Pahlavi, and the Pahlavi dynasty is established. Now, Reza Shah was both an autocrat, but also someone who wanted to change Iran into a world power. So he was not an autocrat in the traditional sense of the monarchs who had preceded him in the immediate past of Iran. Rather, he wanted to integrate Iran into the emerging global system. His ideas of how Iran should, shall we say, enter the 20th century were a mix of monarchism, of democracy, but also the ideas coming from Marxism. So the notion that the nation state has to galvanize and bring about an industrial revolution in Iran so that Iran could march forward, led by him essentially. So he institutes a series of reforms. One of them is a reform of the educational system, Western style secular education, to replace the Islamic madrasa system. Education is made open to women as well. So you see women going through elementary school, middle school, high school, to universities. You also begin to see other changes that, shall we say, were less necessary. So he introduced what's called the Uniform Dress Law, abolishing traditional dress, tribal dress, etc., and replacing it with Western style coats, jackets, ties, all the rest. As some of you may know, Iranians still rebel against wearing ties. Now, in a sense, his actions are almost, shall we say, ironic, because it is Iran that originally gave us pants. So whether it is pajamas or whether it is dress pants, those originally come from the Iranian world. But anyway, so he forces this upon the Iranian people, but many are willing to accept it as part of Iran becoming a part of the global system. He also changes the marriage codes. So marriages in Iran used to be religiously based. What he institutes is civil marriage and also civil divorce codes. So you begin to see women gaining rights in Iran under him, rights that were equivalent to rights that women were beginning to have in the West at that time, so the early 20th century. Okay? This goes along, but there are emerging tensions between Reza Shah and Britain. His original patrons and the new Shah are gradually falling out. And they're falling out because Reza Shah ultimately never really trusted the British. He knew they had brought him to power, and he felt that if he didn't obey them, they would oust him. So as he began to, shall we say, carve an independent nation for Iran, he began to realize that he needed to keep the colonial powers at bay. He didn't have many options at that time. There was a choice between the Russians and eventually the Soviets, the British, but also there was once again Germany. And the emerging Nazis courted Reza Shah. Let's keep in mind, Reza Shah was authoritarian, so Hitler's ideas fit well. And once again, Hitler had this notion of creating a nation state, galvanizing the people and all the rest. That worked well for Reza Shah. Luckily, Reza Shah did not share Hitler's notions of anti-Semitism. But there was anti-Semitism also brewing in Iran at that time as a result of the British and Western presence. All this sort of came to a head when the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union during the Second World War. At that point, Reza Shah was asked to help the British and the United States by providing access to, through Iran to the Soviet Union, so that the Soviets could be supplied with material resources for the war. He refused to do so, claiming that Iran was going to remain territorially neutral. What Iran was hoping was that a defeat of London would permit Iran to break free of the British grasp. what happened in actuality is that the British, the Soviets, and then the Americans moved militarily into Iran. Reza Shah so this is roughly June 1941. Reza Shah was ousted. He was forced to abdicate, and his son was placed on the throne. That worked very well in terms of winning the Second World War, because Iran would become a major conduit for US resources, military resources, to reach the Soviet Union and help the Soviets push the Nazis back. And that eastern pushing back of the Nazis permitted the US and the British to take out the Nazis from the West. Iran, and that was also the point where you have the first American troops landing in Iran, the Persian Gulf Command, actually. So that's when you begin to see Iran becoming part of the Western Alliance, culminating, of course, in that very famous meeting in Tehran with Roosevelt, Stalin, and Winston Churchill, where they decide the future of the world after the Second World War. And as part of that, Tehran is, the promise is made that Tehran will be Iran will be granted its own nationhood once again when the war is over. All that worked out very well, and you had the new Shah, the second monarch of the Pahlavi dynasty, Mohammad Reza Shah, on the throne. But once again, tensions would flare up with the West over oil. And those tensions again came down to the whole issue of what role should Iran play in controlling its own resources, and what compensation should Iran receive in exchange for those resources. And the second Pahlavi Shah was gradually being seen, despite a great deal of changes he was making to the country. Many felt that he was too lax in dealing with the West diplomatically. The matter came to a head, as I said, over crude oil. And the main company pumping the crude oil out of Iran's ground at that time was British Petroleum. British Petroleum at that time was paying Iran less for the oil than it cost British Petroleum to pump it out of the ground, to extract it. So this led to tensions in the Iranian Majlis, or parliament. The Iranian people elected a prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who had been trained as an economist in Paris. Mossadegh was a fierce nationalist who took on the Shah and the British over the oil issue, supported by the parliament. So Mossadegh proceeded to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company, the one that eventually became British Petroleum. He nationalized its assets in Iran. He also sent a letter of demand, several millions of pounds in back dues to Iran, to London. This was rejected by the British government, and the British and the United States suggested negotiations. Mossadegh in turn refused to negotiate, and was gradually Mossadegh, the prime minister, and the parliament was taking over more and more power from the Shah. The Shah attempted to fire Mossadegh. Mossadegh refused to be fired. The parliament backed Mossadegh. Crowds came to the streets in Tehran chanting for the Shah's ouster. And so all this came to a head in August 1953, when the United States recommended to the Shah that he leave Iran for his own safety. So the Shah flew off to Rome, and Washington and London proceeded to stage a counter coup. Mossadegh was ousted. The CIA in particular played a prominent role in this event. The CIA lead on the matter, Kermit Roosevelt, eventually wrote about this. And so within a few days, Mossadegh was ousted. The Shah was back in Iran, back in power. The parliament was suppressed. And the British in particular believed that things would now be calm in terms of their relationship with Iran. However, The net result was that the Iranians now, through those events, had come to view the United States with suspicion, a nation that they previously had not had tensions with. Well, initially, when the Shah was back in charge, he made very serious attempts to reform the economy and to address the people's legitimate needs. So what you begin to see is, first of all, there's a campaign to eliminate illiteracy. So very successful in terms of raising the literacy level of the Iranian population to between 70 to 80%. He also brings about what he called the White Revolution, an attempt to reform Iran industrially. So this is the very early 1960s. One thing the Shah realizes is that a very large part of Iran's land was still controlled by the traditional noble families. So what the Shah's regime does is gradually take over those lands and redistribute them to the farmers who had tilled them for generations. This turned out to be very successful, and by the late 1960s into the early 1970s, you begin to see about 60% of Iran's land being actually owned by small landowners as opposed to large landlords who were never present. So the economy is changing for the better. You begin to see this in terms of per capita income. Per capita income goes up from about $175 in 1960 to about $2,500 by the mid-1970s. Not much in terms of when compared to the United States, but very significant for Iran. But at the same time, as the Shah was opening up the economy, both to the Iranian public, he was also opening up the economy to the West. So you begin to see American companies in particular moving into Iran and taking the opportunity to build up infrastructure and to use Iran as a source from which to extract natural resources, not just oil and natural gas, but also metals and rare earth elements. So we begin to gradually see the Iranian population beginning once again to resent the Western presence. We should keep in mind that Iranians have a long history. They go all the way back to the 6th century BCE in terms of a nation. They are very conscious of this history. They're conscious of it not just at elite levels, but at the popular level. And so this sense of national pride is constantly present. And the presence of anyone else running or controlling their country, even indirectly, creates a backlash. That backlash began to build once again in the 1970s. What was also happening is that the last Pahlavi Shah, in his attempts to modernize Iran, was turning to Iran's pre-Islamic past, and using that to buttress his claims to be an absolute monarch, to be able to make decisions gradually without consulting others, consulting the parliament less and less, but also consulting the traditional religious elite less and less. So he was beginning to consult the mullahs or the Shia clerics less and less. He was also beginning to see the mullahs as impeding progress. He was envisioning a secular society in which all religious groups could live peacefully, in harmony, but in so doing, he was not taking into account the influence of religion in the society. Iran had, since 1501, been a traditionally Shia nation, a Shia Muslim nation. And by eliminating the clergy from any role, even indirectly in the nation, he was gradually creating tensions between the state and Iran's religious establishment. As this was happening, as the clergy and also as Iranian nationalists began to reject not so much the Shah's economic changes, but his political changes, the Shah became more and more authoritarian. His secret police would round up individuals, and some of them would be jailed, others would be forced into exile. One such individual forced into exile was an Ayatollah, namely a very senior Iranian Shia cleric named Ayatollah Khomeini. Ruhollah Khomeini had been trained in Qom, in the traditional madrasas of Iran, and it was in those madrasas when he was teaching that he began denouncing the Shah's reforms. He felt that religion should continue to play a part not just in people's beliefs but also in the economic and social values of Iran. He was forced out of the country into exile and eventually ended up in southern Iraq, teaching there and calling for the Shah's ouster. In January 1978, some of his students at Qom went out in protest in the streets. The Shah's military moved in very rapidly. There was bloodshed. The protests continued and spread from Qom to Tehran to Shiraz, Isfahan, and the other major cities of Iran. The protests continued to percolate throughout 1978. Then, in September 1978, at a series of protests around the country, the Shah's troops opened fire. There were many lives lost from across the Iranian spectrum of politics. Various individuals who had begun to oppose the Shah, some of them opposing monarchy, some of them wanting religion back, some of them wanting to have a democratic society. So what was happening is that a wide variety of individuals were coming together from different political, social, and economic backgrounds to oppose the Shah. By November, the Shah's military was having a very hard time controlling the protests. In December 1978, the US government advised the Shah once again to leave Iran for his own safety. He did so on January 16th, 1979. By this time, the Ayatollah Khomeini had moved to Paris, had galvanized a variety of Iranian dissidents who had been forced out of Iran over the past decade. Those individuals rallied around Khomeini. Khomeini at that time was very careful in terms of what he actually spoke about. He had long championed an Islamic state. However, when he realized the revolution was actually about to occur, he switched gear. He talked about democracy. He talked about religion having just a small role in the society. In other words, he cloaked his own views very astutely. The result is that February 1st, 1979, he returned to Iran. Very quickly it became clear that he and the mullahs had the groundwork in place, as opposed to all the other political opposition groups who had been forced out of Iran, whose organizations had been destroyed by the Shah. And so the mullahs were best placed to gradually take over the society. And that's exactly what they did. They switched gears. Now they spoke about having an Islamic state. The Shah's supporters were rounded up and executed. It became a very traditional revolution, very bloody. And you began to see the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Many Iranians, particularly those with secular leanings, fled to the West. It gave rise to the estimated 1 million Iranians who now live in the United States. Others went to Canada, to various countries in Europe, particularly England. Relations with the United States deteriorated very quickly with the seizure of the US Embassy in Tehran. Those who seized it claimed they did so fearing that the US would use the embassy to mount yet another coup and bring the Shah back. Irrespective of the truth of that matter, and as far as we can tell, the Carter administration at that time did not intend to bring the Shah back to Iran. But the embassy seizure led to the break of relations with the US and led to a spiraling cycle of deteriorating relations with the US. In Iran, what you began to see is that Khomeini was declared the Reba, or the supreme leader. He was essentially proclaimed just by revolution as opposed to being elected. He then subsequently established an Islamic constitution under which, after his demise, the subsequent supreme leader was elected not by the people but by an assembly of experts, of religious experts. So Khomeini was the first supreme leader of Iran until his death in 1989, so a period of 10 years. He was succeeded by another Ayatollah, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is the present supreme leader. So Khamenei became the second supreme leader of Iran, elected by this assembly of experts. The assembly of experts is a body, a constitutional body of 86 Shia clergymen. The clergymen are each elected, those 86 clergymen are elected for 8-year terms of office. So the assembly of experts is elected by the people. They then appoint the supreme leader for life. The assembly of experts has the ability to remove the supreme leader as well, though that proves very difficult once the supreme leader is in charge, because he's essentially, shall we say, a replacement of the Shah. And that's not what the Iranian people really wanted. The Islamic constitution set the age of voting, so universal suffrage, at the age of 16 years or older. The Islamic constitution also established executive, legislative and judicial branches of parliament in addition to the theocratic branch. So the executive branch is very similar to that in the United States. It is headed by a president. The president is elected for 4 years. Popular election by the people. Winner-take-all majority system, just as in the US. The president can run for a second term of office. The president of Iran, however, under the constitution of Iran, cannot run for a third consecutive term. They will sit out an election after being elected twice. Then they can run a third time. However, no Iranian president has been elected to a third term of office. Essentially, the individual's grasp on power slips after 2 terms. So you have a president. The president gets to appoint a cabinet of ministers, and the president also oversees the National Security Council of Iran. The legislative branch, or the parliament, called the Majlis, comprises 290 elected representatives. It is a unicameral branch, unlike the United States, which is bicameral. Okay? So those members are each elected to 4-year terms by popular election according to areas in Iran, electoral districts of Iran. However, in order to be able to stand for election to the Majlis of Parliament, each candidate has to be certified by what's called the Council of Guardians of the Constitution. The Council of Guardians of the Constitution is a body of 6 clerics or mullahs appointed by the supreme leader and 6 Muslim scholars who needn't be clerics appointed by the parliament in consultation with other officials. So those 12 officials, shall we say, vet the candidacies to ensure that most of the candidates conform with the Islamic ideals. So it's not a completely fair system. In addition, Iran has religious minorities. Sunni Muslims, Zoroastrians, the traditional religion of Iran before the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, also small Jewish and Christian groups. The Christians, the traditional Christians of Iran, tend to be Armenian Christians and Assyrian or Nestorian Christians. Those minority groups are also given membership in parliament. The Zoroastrians, the Jews, and the Nestorian or Syrian Christians are each allowed to elect 1 representative. The Armenian Christians are allowed 2 because they tend to be more numerous. Differences between the parliament and the executive branch are mediated by various committees who are also appointed. The judicial branch is also appointed. It is appointed, it has a chief justice, it has associate justices, but one little catch. All members of the judicial branch, that is all justices, whether at the district or state level or up to the Supreme Court level, all have to be Muslim clerics. So the system once again is weighted towards the Islamic system of governance. In addition, Iran also has an internal, in addition to the police, the Navy, the Air Force, and the military and the army, so the traditional military, Iran also has what's called the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, the Pastaran. The Pastaran, as some of you may know, have been associated with terrorist plots around the world. The Pastaran are, or shall we say, the Pastaran help the supreme leader enforce Islamic values within the country. They are augmented by what are called the Basij, a paramilitary. And it is the Basij who generally are sent out to the streets to put down protests against the mullahs. The Basij and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards report not to the President of Iran, but to the supreme leader. The traditional military reports to the President, just as in the United States. But here in Iran, the similarity is that you have this, should I say, special shock troops and a paramilitary group that reports to the supreme leader and to whom more resources are allocated, so that they can be used directly by the supreme leader without consulting the executive, legislative, or judicial branches. So what you have is a modern nation state with a population of about 74 million people, 90% of whom are Shia Muslims, 8% are Sunni Muslims, the remaining 2% are Zoroastrians, Jews, Christians, and other small groups like the Mandeans. The Mandeans claim descent from John the Baptist. Okay. But so you have a population of about 74 million people, most of whom speak Farsi or the Persian language, even though there are other languages in Iran, regional languages like Baluchi, Mazandarani, but also Arabic in the southwest, because of contact between people who live in southwestern Iran and the people of the United Arab Emirates and the Arabian Peninsula. In some ways, the Islamic Revolution has been very beneficial to Iran. It has focused on literacy, so even the education of women has continued. Literacy tends to be about 78% overall in terms of the population. 80% men, about 76% of women in Iran are literate. So literacy has continued to rise. There's been great attention to healthcare. So life expectancy has gone up to the mid to late 70s in terms of age for both men and women. Infant mortality has dropped considerably to around 3%. So those aspects of Iranian culture have benefited, and Iranian society have benefited. On the other hand, however, the mullahs tend to be very suspicious of the West, convinced that there are attempts to oust them from power. The mullahs also, because they are Shia, traditionally are suspicious of Sunni Muslims. So they tend to be suspicious of Saudi Arabia and most of the Middle East. That divide between Sunnis and Shia go all the way back to the origins of Islam in the 6th century of the Common Era. So 6th century CE or AD, you have the whole issue between in the early Muslim community as to who is going to succeed the Prophet Muhammad. The Shia are those who follow the family of Muhammad and believe that religious and political authority should have remained with the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. The majority of Muslims in the Middle East and elsewhere feel, however, that religious authority remains with clergy, and not so much a hereditary clergy like you have in Shiism, but religious scholars like you have in Sunnism. And the Sunnis also believe that political power should not be with the clergy, that it should be with secular leaders, whether those are monarchs or elected politicians. In Iran and among the Shia, however, the belief that state and religion should be together is partly what inspired people like the Ayatollah Khomeini to take over. And so the clergy of Iran remain very suspicious of other Muslims and also of non-Iranians, fearing that their religious way of life is one that is not accepted by the rest of the world. So they attempt to control communication with the West, or communication, shall we say, outside Iran in general. What has happened in the last 5 years or so is that despite the clergy's best attempts to control information flow, cell phones, internet cafes have been changing the Iranian way of life. Another important issue that feeds into modern Iran is that roughly 50% of the population of Iran, so 50% of this 74 million population, was born after the Islamic Revolution of 1979. So these are individuals who have no idea of monarchy, who have no links to what the older generations of Iran see as monarchist oppression. What 50% or more of Iranians see is an inflexible theocratic system of governance by clergymen who tell them how to dress, what to watch, how to behave, and also who to have contact with or not have contact with outside their country. So what you end up seeing is a large part of the Iranian population being dissatisfied with their way of life and increasingly seeing the regime as not respecting and representing their values and their aspirations. In addition, the Iranian economy in the 20th and 21st centuries has traditionally come to rely on the export of oil and natural gas. So in other words, economic diversification didn't really occur. So in Iran, the major export is crude oil, followed by natural gas, and then about 10% of the exports are carpets. So they don't really have a robust economy interacting with the world. As a result, the Iranian economy has begun contracting. That contraction has led to unemployment. Unemployment ranging up to about 25 to 30%. That unemployment takes an even greater toll on recent university graduates, because Iran has a robust educational system. The individuals come out of university, well trained, expecting employment, and finding very little employment, whether it's in the government sector or the private sector. That adds to dissatisfaction. In the meantime, of course, the Islamic Republic has supported terrorist groups around the world. They have been developing a very robust nuclear program. The Islamic Republic's leaders continue to claim that a nuclear program is directed at nuclear energy to replace oil. The International Atomic Energy Agency has increasingly ratcheted up its reports that indicate that Iran is simultaneously pursuing atomic weapons in violation of its agreements with in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the net result is that as tensions have mounted with the West, the United States and the UN Security Council have imposed a series of economic sanctions on Iran. Those sanctions have hit Iran where it hurts most: its export of oil, crude oil, and natural gas. That has further contracted Iran's economic growth and exacerbated its unemployment. So, so what you end up is the Iranian national budget is roughly about 51 billion US dollars in terms of income, but in terms of revenues, the revenues tend to be about double that. So the Iranian economy is falling behind rapidly, and it's taking its toll also on the Iranian currency. The Iranian currency used to be fairly stable, around between 6,000 to about 9,000 Iranian riyals to $1 US. And now it takes about 13,000 riyal to get $1 US. So the value of the currency is depreciating. Iran's access to hard currencies is falling. As the economy contracts, people are pulling money out of circulation, buying gold, for example. So Iran is undergoing major economic problems. Those economic problems are leading to mounting dissatisfaction. The current supreme leader has reacted, the Ayatollah Khamenei has reacted by stressing Islamic values more rather than addressing the economic problems. In the meantime, Iran has a new president, someone infamous in the West, Mohammad Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad was initially elected mayor of Tehran as a technocrat. He was trained as an engineer. He has a PhD in engineering from the University of Tehran, and seemed to be a good administrator by running the capital city of Tehran. He very quickly ran for the presidency of Iran, was elected, and then began to antagonize the rest of the world. The political situation came to a head in the summer of 2009, the most recent Iranian presidential election. At that time, or shall we say in the run-up to the elections, it appeared that Iran was actually liberalizing politically. For the first time ever, they had presidential debates between the major candidates. There were robust public political campaigns going on. The Iranian press was publishing all views or political views. And then the theocracy panicked. They felt that Ahmadinejad would not be elected president. And so at ballot time, it appears that the ballots were stuffed, and the theocracy behaved much like the Chicago machine used to behave here in the United States. And the net result was that Ahmadinejad was re-elected. Riots broke out in major Iranian cities as it became clear that the tallies did not really reflect the true ballots that were cast. But the Islamic Revolutionary Guards and the Basij went out, suppressed the revolt. The revolt, however, did spawn what's called the Green Movement. The Green Movement was pushing for social, economic change in Iran, was arguing that the mullahs should return to being clergymen as opposed to politicians. It gained a great deal of support in Iran, particularly among Iran's young population. The problem with the Green Movement, however, was that its leaders were drawn from the old political elite, that is, individuals who had been part of the revolution and had served in the revolutionary government. So the leaders who had been part, former presidents, former prime ministers, former speakers of the Iranian parliament, these individuals became the leaders of the Green Movement. The result was that those individuals ultimately did not offer true change, and between the lack of new ideas in the Green Movement and the violent suppression by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards and the Basij, Iran's opportunity for political change gradually died out. However, the populist uprisings in 2009 quickly showed the re-elected President Ahmadinejad and his supporters that the way forward was not with the clergy. So they began to break off from the clergy. They turned to Iran's history and past. They started championing nationalism. They started arguing for liberalization of social values. They started talking about attempting to reach a deal with the International Atomic Energy Agency and the United Nations on the nuclear issue. They too very quickly ran into opposition from the clergy and the hardliners who do not want accommodation with the West because they fear political change. So where Iran sits right now is at a very interesting point in time. The next parliamentary elections are in March of 2012. Then in 2014, we have the next presidential elections. Ahmadinejad cannot run for the presidency because he had 2 terms. The clergy are attempting to ensure that his supporters do not get to run for either in the parliamentary elections or the presidential elections, because they fear that those individuals are even more liberal internally than Ahmadinejad has become. Ahmadinejad continues to remain someone who is an anti-Semite, who is in many ways anti-Western in generally. But in Iran, he has become popular despite those aspects because he's been pushing for social and economic change. The net result is that the supreme leader has now floated the idea of abolishing the presidency altogether so that there will no longer be presidential elections. The Guardian Council has announced that they are going to very carefully examine all candidates for the next parliamentary elections to ensure that anyone who is championing change, whether it is from Ahmadinejad's group or from the Green Movement, will not be allowed to run. Of course, all this has resulted in constant turmoil politically in Iran. And Iran remains, shall we say, ripe for yet another revolution. The Iranians are well aware of what's happening across the Arab Middle East in terms of the Arab Spring. They see democratic movements ousting dictatorial ones. And Iranians too are clamoring for change, with one big difference. Unlike the Arab Middle East, where it's secular elected politicians, secular autocrats, and also secular monarchs who are being challenged, in Iran the challenge is against Islamists. And so when Iranians next bring about their own political spring, they will be ousting the mullahs and bringing about a secular state. And that is perhaps the best hope that Iran has. Now, we shouldn't, however, in closing, feel that when change comes to Iran, that it will result in the complete elimination of religion from politics. No. What Iranians will do is they are more likely to return the clergy back to being religious guides and moving them out of politics and returning and attempting to create a secular state. And that is perhaps the best hope for Iran. Thank you.